Welcome to the Backstage Creative, the podcast that focuses on the people who work behind the scenes of theater. My name is Krista Copper, the host and creator of this show. Some of the topics that I love talking the most about deal with creativity and deal with the process of creativity and what it takes to create something, whether it's a book or a symphony or a play or any sort of creative endeavor. I think it takes so much courage to put something out into the world and to say, like Seth Godin says, "Here, look, I made this." You open yourself up to criticism and the possible rejection, and I think it takes so much courage to put a creative project out into the world. I have so much admiration and respect for people who do just that, who make a living creating and writing and composing and putting things out in the world that may succeed and may fail. To that end, today is my conversation with Rachel Dean. Rachel is a playwright and a composer and a musician and pianist who lives in New York City. She is involved with theater in a lot of really neat ways, and so it was such a blast to sit down and talk with her. If you're listening to this in the future, we recorded this interview in March 2020, which was in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. So this interview and several interviews in the following months will reference that pandemic and how it's impacting what we do and our job and our life and our finances and all of the things that this season of life is bringing. So I enjoyed this conversation a lot, and I know that you will as well. So here we go. Here's my conversation with the very wise and the very creative Rachel Dean. What's New York City like? Is it pretty bizarre?
It's a little weird. I think I would notice it more if I lived in Manhattan, where you see all those pictures of an empty Times Square. But like, I live in Astoria in Queens, where it's like a little less populated already. And I would say I see about as many people out still because we're still allowed to like take walks and stuff. And I think people are really relying on that to keep their mental health good. But it's definitely weird working from home and like I work at NYU and I realized that I might not see my students again this semester. And we had to, postpone their showcase and all of these things, try to figure out what's happening with recitals. And I know that I'm one of the lucky ones because most of my friends are now essentially unemployed. But NYU is still paying us through the end of the semester to help with online work. So I feel very privileged in that way. But most people are like, now what do I do with all my free time?
Yeah. Yeah, this is an instance where like side projects are the best, like having a podcast, or I know some people
Yeah,
have a blog, but just to have something to work on so you're not just like sitting around binge watching TV all day.
totally. Yeah, absolutely.
So what do you do at NYU?
I'm a staff pianist there, so my main responsibilities are accompanying their year-round showcase class. So it starts in the fall as an audition skills class where we build up their rep in their books, and we hold mock auditions for different types and genres of shows, so that they, by the end of the semester, they've got like a robust book that they can take to pretty much any audition. And then the second semester is when we narrow down from there, or from like all songs ever, and try to figure out what their 1 minute 20-second showcase cut is going to be for the showcase that we would have initially had in May. Um, and then they also do something called musical headshots, where we do something in the recording studio and they upload that so that agents and casting directors and people can see that. And then I just accompany lessons. I accompany a contemporary vocal workshop that's taught by Sherry Sanders. And I play for a group voice class, just a bunch of random things along those lines.
So is it mostly are you just playing? Or are you doing some teaching?
It's mostly playing, and I actually prefer that. I like when other people are in charge and I just get to support the students and make them feel safe. And like the biggest compliment they give me is like, I love when you're at the piano because I know that I just don't have to worry.
Hmm.
So it's really nice for me. And sometimes in my one-on-one work with the students, it'll veer a little bit into coaching, but I'm not actually a teacher. I'm just a staff pianist.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that's one of the I think the best compliments you could get from someone is like, "Oh, I don't have to worry when you're, behind when you have the baton or when you're behind the drum
Yeah.
set," or, that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really nice.
One of the things that I really wanna talk to you about is that you wrote a show, is that correct?
Yes. Multiple shows.
Oh gosh, that's so awesome. How do you what does that look like, the process of writing a show? Are you working with other people? Is it kind of just you sitting at the piano? What does your process look like for that?
Yeah, I would say it's different for every writer and every writer group. I sort of discovered collaboration while I was in college, and I was just doing it for fun remotely with someone who is still one of my co-writers today. And it was just so much more fun to write with someone else and put my brain with another brain because I was studying composition in college, and that was a very solitary activity. That was a lot of just like sitting at a computer for hours, and then eventually maybe you get to hear it with real live musicians. But most of the time, it was a very like lonely activity. And the more I sort of ventured into the theater world, the more I kind of grew intoxicated with collaboration and how fun it is. And I consider myself a stronger music writer than lyric or word writer. So I like to play to my own strengths and just work with someone else who does the lyric thing very well. And then we can just sort of do the comparative advantages of both. Some of my collaborations are what we would call handoffs, where someone will write a lyric and then they'll send it to me, and maybe we'll talk a little bit back and forth about tweaking the lyric, and then I'll write the music. And then some of them are more like very much in the room. We're coming up with both parts together at the same time, where I'm usually the one sitting at the piano and the other person is usually writing lyrics. But some of my collaborators are also composers. So we can sort of inform each other's process that way. Yeah, it's all over the map, and it really varies even from project to project with the same person.
About how long does that process take from, like, the initial idea and, "Hey, I wanna collaborate with you," to getting, like, a first, reading of the show?
It's a great question. So for my studies at NYU, where I went to grad school for musical theater writing, we had to write 90 minutes worth of a musical over the course of our second year there. So it was like a 9-month process essentially. I guess 12 if you count the summer. So we had to get like a kind of a complete first draft done over the course of a year. And then there are other things that I've worked at and like chipped away at that just started as a collection of songs that we wrote over the course of a few years. And then we strung it together with a book and tried to make it a collection that had a through line. And then there was another piece recently that I was commissioned to do where the artistic director of a theater approached me after working with me on something else and was like, "Hey, we have this grant. We are trying to do a midsummer musical with LGBT characters. Would you be interested in writing it?" And that turnaround from that conversation to the first draft was probably 10 months. But then in that, I also had to approach a collaborator, and we didn't really get cracking on it until basically the spring. So we wrote the first draft of that in a very short time. It ended up, the bulk of the work was like 7 weeks.
Ugh.
I would not recommend it. But we did it and it wasn't bad.
How do you decide that something is done? Like, "Okay, we're not gonna mess with anything anymore, we're not gonna change anything anymore, like, this is the final draft." How do you reach that decision?
That's such a good question, and I haven't reached that place with really any of my projects that I'm working on actively now. So some of the things are in their third or fourth year, and some are in their like sixth or seventh year. And it's not like we're working on it all the time. There's sort of spurts where it's like, oh well, we got this festival, so we should write a new draft for that. But it sort of lies dormant for a long time otherwise, while each of us is working on other projects or life happens and we just get busy. My cute answer to that would be when it's published and you're not allowed to change it anymore. But even like Frozen on Broadway just incorporated, they I think they like took out a song and put in a new song based on changes that they made on the tour. So like even quote Frozen shows unquote, sorry, can be changed, and I find that fascinating. I've been part of shows on Broadway where they revise the rehearsal book every few months to a year or whatever, depending on who's in charge. Some people are just like, they're fine with letting it lie. And then other people are like, never quite satisfied. It's this negotiation of it'll probably never be exactly perfect. And I don't think art can really be perfect. I would be hard pressed to name what I think a perfect musical is because I think everything is a little bit flawed. So coming to a point where you're like, all right, this is good enough, and it has found its sort of it's hit its stride in a
Mm,
way.
mhm.
Um, yeah.
when I was in college for music, you have to take like an arranging class and a composition class, and I hated it because I would just torture myself. Like,
Yes.
the day that you're supposed to turn something in, you're like, oh, if I just change, oh, what if this part went in this instrument instead of the other one? Like, I was just constantly like second guessing and trying to tweak things, but
Right.
like trying to find like, okay, it's done, let it go, it's done.
Yeah. And plus in college and also in life, you have like huge time constrictions where you don't really get to tweak things until they're perfect because you have 5 other gigs to go to and you just kind of have to be like, "All right, well this is what it is for now."
Hmm.
um yeah, yeah. But I think my time having to write on deadline in college and grad school really helped me to sort of shed the a little bit of the perfectionism and just be like, all right, just get out a draft. Everyone understands that this is just a draft and it does not have to be perfect so that you're just creating more than self editing, if that makes sense.
Hmm. I heard a really good quote by someone super famous. I can always think of really good quotes, but I can never remember who said them.
I can
Um,
identify with that.
and I always feel bad because I'm like, I want to give this person credit. But
Yeah.
it was saying like, creativity and analyzing are two separate things. And so sometimes you have to say, okay, I'm creating right now. And then sometimes you have to say, okay, right now I'm analyzing. And you have to
Hmm.
have like kind of separate brains in order to do those things.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's you can sort of do it in chunks, or you can do it like I'm gonna write in the nighttime and then I'm gonna edit in the morning, and that works well for me because I'm not a morning person. So I'm a little more critical and just sort of like getting the stuff done grumpily than, than in like a free flowing like creating state. Yeah, it's hard to do both at the same time, and I think a lot of us get caught up in that. And if I may go on a tangent, I sometimes volunteer at the 52nd Street Project, which works with kids in Hell's Kitchen to serve them just a platter of different arts and that they wouldn't normally get in school. And so, like, I often am writing songs with 12-year-olds who are just writing these amazingly brilliant and hilarious lyrics because they're not reached the point yet where they're self editing and
Mm.
second guessing everything that they say in the way that I think a lot of adults do. And that's so refreshing to just be like, this is definitely not a masterpiece, but it is so incisive or funny or fresh and fun. And so I think a lot of times it's helpful to just, yeah, do what you were saying about trying to separate out the editing and the creating.
Hmm. Do you ever get stuck in the process, and how do you get yourself out of that?
Oh, that's a good question. I think one thing that's really great in this is writing with other people rather than writing alone because if I find it a lot easier to kind of bounce ideas back and forth off of people. It can be really frustrating if you have several sessions in a row where things are not coming out. I have one project where we're just like, I still don't know what the second song is, and we've written 5 different songs for that moment, and none of them are right. And we're just gonna leave it as is for now. But I had a great teacher in college, Dorothy Heineman, who would say, every I'm paraphrasing, but every hour that you spend in front of a blank computer without putting in any notes is still an hour that you spent that you needed to write the piece, which I
Hmm.
it helps me frame it a lot better because then it doesn't feel like wasted time. It's like you did the work, you sat down and you thought about it, and even if you didn't up with anything this time, like your brain has done some work, and so that's helpful even in the midst of a very frustrating process.
I really like there's an author and speaker named Seth Godin, and he talks a lot about creativity, and he talks a lot about just getting something down,
Hmm.
just even if it's not good, just writing something, just putting out something.
Yeah.
And I've like noticed that so much with this podcast, especially like I didn't know what I was doing, the
Sure.
first
Yeah.
several months, but I was like, okay, like just get through the awkward stage and kind of get through those ruts of where you're like, I don't know where this is going. And
Hmm.
eventually, the more action you take and the more you put energy you put into it, like that creates clarity eventually.
Totally. Yeah, yeah. It reminds me again, now we're quoting back and forth, but of Ira Glass's great quote, and I also am paraphrasing this, but it's like, it's okay for your taste to be more developed than your skill at first because you spent your
Ooh.
whole life developing taste and like figuring out what kind of movies you like. And it might take a long time for you to be able to make a movie like the movies that you like. And that's a hard thing to sort of measure up against until you can visualize it like that and be like, oh yeah, it's okay. And no one came out of the womb a master at their craft. And
Mhm.
they
Yeah.
all did terrible things at one point because you have to get better.
Mhm. Yeah, I whenever I get stuck, I remind myself of like what it felt like to first play the bass and how
Mm.
how bad it was, and like it took years and years and years to get better at that. But yeah, it just takes anything you do, it takes time to get better and to get faster and more efficient, and
Yeah.
it's always, everything is a process. So back to your musical, so you have the first draft, you're ready to go. How do you find people to do a reading or space, or how do you get it out into the world?
Yeah, such a good question. So at NYU, part of the sort of package deal is that the end of the year comes with a reading with equity actors. So they help you cast your show with a pool of actors that they've sort of pre-vetted, people who are able to take on a diversity of styles, who are good with like changes in the room, because we're often throwing them new pages every day. People who are good sight readers, that kind of thing. And so you sort of, that was a great starting point to be like, oh, all of the people that I'm seeing in my project and all of my friends' projects are people who can like really, who like to take on new material and are very good at absorbing it and making it work. So that was a great sort of starting point for me. And then just because I accompany all these students at NYU and I play for auditions and rehearsals of other shows, I sort of like mentally collect people. I'm like, oh, I really like this person. I bet that they would be an awesome choreographer for our piece or whatever. And the funny thing that I'm sort of learning is that people on Broadway, especially, a lot of them are hungry to do new work because they're just in the same show every night and that is their steady gig. But it might not be as artistically fulfilling as creating a role or starting on something sort of from the ground up. And so I've been surprised by how generous people are with their time, and they're just like, yeah, I'll do a workshop that's 10 to 6 every day and then go over to my Broadway show at night. And I'm like, that's great for you. I'm glad you could do that. In terms of finding space, it feels like a lot of like lucky breaks. Our first industry reading of Medusa, the show that I was working on at NYU, was in a film studio actually, because my co-writers' parents had met this guy who lived in New York and was a filmmaker on a cruise, and then they introduced him to my co-writer, who then was like, hey, we have this piece. So it was like the most random connection, and it ended up being really beautiful, and the investors were especially interested because they're like, wow, we've never seen anything in this space before, and it's like we can't really take credit for it. But glad that you like it. At a certain point, I think getting spaces is also about just like having funding. And that's something that I'm still figuring out. I feel like I'm very much fumbling around in the dark about that. And I think most writers are, because they're not really involved in or knowledgeable about the business side of things. And that's where finding a producer comes in really handy, who can sort of take the lead on those things and engage with investors and invite them to things, and sign them up for our newsletters and take them out for coffee, and just like begin this long sort of courting process where someone's interested in the show, but maybe they won't give you money until you have a date on the books. They're like, okay, yes, we're gonna fund this thing that you're doing at this place. Or they've paid money for something that you had in the past, and then you have to go back to them in the future and be like, well, now we're doing this thing and we need more money. That's, for me, it's very hard to ask people for money because
Hmm.
I think a lot of people will share that. But the thing that has helped me to remember is that these people who regularly give money to shows are doing it because they want to, and they want to help, and they want to be useful in this way. And then to say, oh yeah, I invested in that when it was just in its first industry reading, and now it's on Broadway. Even though we also have to constantly communicate to them that there's a very low chance that any show ever makes it to Broadway statistically, much less recoups. So yeah, that's a great question that I'm still learning now, and it's a lot of, I feel like, catch as catch can, and remembering that you probably do know at least a couple of people who are willing to help out, but it's the figuring out how to talk to them about that is difficult.
Yeah, I think there's a way to do like marketing and asking people for money in a way that doesn't feel like sleazy.
Yes, uh-huh. And that whole, like, you also can't be apologetic about it. You just have to be like, yeah, this is worth investing money in, and it's okay that we're talking about figures larger than I have ever seen in my entire life. Because it's not for me. You're not asking for yourself personally. It's for something that you believe in and are championing, and it's really hard. It's a weird like ego balance thing. I have one co-writer who is just like probably one of the most confident people I've ever met. And he walks into meetings and is like, well, yeah, of course you're investing in our show. And I'm like, if you want to, we would love it.
Yeah.
Just like sort of counterbalancing him. And I think That's also helpful, I've found, because different people are attracted to different energies. And so even though I come with it at a more, not humble, but a less brash angle, maybe, or less forward. I don't know. I think that he does a great job with this. I don't want to put him down in any way, but I think that our approaches are just so different and they balance really well. Yeah, I think investors are just attracted to different types of people, and just to represent a larger variety of people on your team, people who are both like super go getter and people who are just like grateful for you to be there, is a pretty good bet. As far as I know, again, I'm very much still learning.
Do you have any advice for people who maybe who are in school, or like the 12-year-olds you work with who want to write a show?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I would say is to just try something, especially when you're in school. I find that like people are very open to helping and supplying you with resources if you ask. And it can seem like a really daunting thing, but if you just go ahead and try it, I feel like the best time to fail is when you're in those like protective school environments, and where you have access to all your friends who can help you, or you see if anybody else wants to write with you, or if your teacher can advise you on the dramaturgy of it and things like that. Definitely just do it, because the sooner you start doing it, the sooner you'll get better at it.
Hmm.
And it'll be so cool to be like, well, I wrote my first musical when I was in high school, or whatever the case may be. It's a really cool badge of honor.
I just listened to a podcast. Do you know Brene Brown?
I have heard so much about her, and I have yet to check her out.
Yeah, she just started a podcast, and her first episode was was about FFT, and it means fucking first time, and so, and she talks about just getting the first time out of the way.
Yeah.
Like it's gonna be bad, it's gonna be
Hmm.
messy, it's not gonna be exactly how you want in your head, but like just get that first time out of the way. So that's good advice.
Yeah. I wish that I guess it's hard because we're all measuring up to what we see as final products. And of course, it's not going to be that good. And I wish that people like Sondheim and JRB would like release their first drafts. And sometimes they do. They're like, look at this page that like this little piece made it into the musical and everything else was trash. And I find that super helpful to be like, oh yeah, everyone else scribbles too. And everyone else has to throw a bunch of stuff out, even the people that we most admire. So it would be nice to be able to hold ourselves up against their first drafts instead of their final drafts, for
Hmm.
sure.
Yeah. Awesome. Are you still the rehearsal accompanist for Hamilton?
I am. Yes, I am one of there's a whole team of us.
Okay, so why do theaters have rehearsal accompanists? What does that job do? What do you do?
Yeah. So mostly, once a show gets running, the main cast doesn't need to rehearse because they're already doing it every night, unless they need like a pickup, brush up rehearsal. But the people that we're rehearsing is people who are already in the show but are learning different tracks. So they're one character and they're learning another character, or they're swings, so they're not really in the show every night, but they have learned these 5 tracks, and so whenever people call out, they can go slot in for one of them. Or when somebody's contract is up and they're leaving the show, and so we're training someone new. Or when someone's going to go into a tour, but we just happen to be able to train them here because we eventually want them to be in both shows, or whatever it is. So they sort of just like keep things humming while the show is running at night. We either rehearse during the day, or sometimes actors are contractually obligated to be either at the theater or in rehearsal during show times. And so if they don't need to be observing the show, we will rehearse at the same time as the show in a different location, that kind of thing.
That sounds cool that you can work with all of those people. Do you get nervous when you walk into a room and there's if you're like working with like the big Broadway stars, but do you ever get nervous doing that job?
Yeah, for sure. I think often of this quote that, oh gosh, now I can't remember his name. Anthony Ramos, not sure. The original Philip Lawrence in the cast. And someone was asking him about, like, do you ever, like, really process the enormity of what's happening to you? And he was like, I am purposely not thinking about it because it is going to be overwhelming if I do. And I'm like, I totally get that. So it's sort of a like, oh, this is fine. This is not a big deal. And the more that I do it, the more I sort of get used to it. But like, definitely after my first initial audition for Hamilton went well, and then I walked past Lin-Manuel Miranda on the way to the elevator. Once I got in the elevator, I did like a little victory dance. So it's just like trying to keep your cool. I kind of think of it similarly to like dating in a way, and how you just like kind of have to like put your nerves to the side and just be the person that you are, which is sometimes a tall order. But yeah, a lot of like just mentally tricking myself into being like, this is fine. It's all fine. And the more I do it, the more I get comfortable, and the more I'm like, oh, these people are also just like normal people wanting to make art and generally wanting to get along with people and be kind. And that is really great too. And sort of helps me be like, oh, they're human. Or if they're mean, then I'm like, oh, well, then they're mean. I
Yeah.
don't need to be nervous around them.
When I've played for like master classes for big people in the bass world,
Hmm.
you're like, oh, like this is just a person. Like, oh,
Yes.
okay, it's just another person that plays the bass.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, and when I would observe other rehearsal pianists or when I would sit in the pit and watch, like they made mistakes too. They just beat themselves up for it. Just like anybody else. And so that made me feel better too. I was like, oh, okay, okay, okay. None of us are perfect. And we all want to be perfect and are probably too hard on ourselves for not being perfect. But at least we're all sort of in good company in that respect,
Hmm.
which was sort of surprising to me, I think. I sort of expected when I came to the city that I would have to like do a lot of practicing and work to even get into any rooms. And I think it turned out that the work that I did in college to just like accompany all of my friends and absorb as much music as possible sort of paid off because I sort of became a better sight reader and had a better knowledge of the canon. I guess I expected there to be a virtuoso pianist in every single audition room and show and everything. And it's not really that. It's more like, can you do your job as a musician? Yes. But also, are you a fun hang? Are you
Hmm.
someone that is like going to be someone that people want to be around 8 shows a week? Or are you going to be a good leader in the room if that's your position? Or are you going to be a good supporter if that's your position? And just figuring out how to exist best in the room and be a good person and contribute to a good community.
I think sometimes it's not like you said, like it's not necessarily the best people in the city who are the ones that are working the most. It's the people who are obviously good at what they do, but also show up on time and dress
Yeah.
appropriately and
Uh,
respond to emails efficiently and
right.
yeah, are kind to others. And
Yeah.
there's a whole other skill set besides just being good at your instrument
Right.
needed to be in this career for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So take us through your background, where you're from, how you got into theater and playing piano, and where you went to school, and how you kind of highlights that got you to where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which is the second biggest city with a whopping 130,000 people in the state. Um, and I went to a private religious school through 8th grade and was not really exposed to music other than like worship music there and in my home. And then I went to a public high school. That was kind of a big shock for me. I was going from a class of 24 people to a class of like 500 and seeing and hearing things I had never seen or heard before.
Yeah.
I felt like I was walking around in an R-rated movie for a while until I got used to it, and I was like, okay, all right, this is fine. So I ended up starting to accompany musicals at my school. And I think once they realized that they had me as a resource, they started doing more musicals per year. I don't have this on any authority at all. I just sort of suspect. I'm like, huh, they picked a fall musical that was like heavily featuring piano. I'm not sad about it. It was great for my growth. Like I had to learn the Fantastics, which is a ridiculous piano part. We did I Love You, You're Perfect Now Change, just a bunch of shows, and that was sort of my first exposure to any kind of music outside of that worship music. And so I had started writing for fun just songs when I was like 11, but then those musical sounds sort of started to filter into what I was writing, and people would be like, this sounds like a musical theater song, and I kind of wanted to be like a singer songwriter, and I was like, no, it's not. But then I went to the University of Miami in Florida for composition, and I practiced piano a bunch while I was there. I actually auditioned I thought about auditioning to be a double major in performance, but I heard back that the piano professors were not impressed by my initial audition, which was fair. I hadn't practiced enough, and like my whole last 2 years of high school, I sort of skated by. And I was like, well, I'll show them by just accompanying every one of my friends and getting better, and like that's not going to show them anything obviously, but it was great for my growth.
Yeah.
And then my best friend was also a pianist, and he was playing in the theater department and sort of got me into playing for classes and shows in the theater department too. And so my work was sort of drifting more and more towards the musical theater bent. And I was collaborating with people outside of school for fun. And I eventually, for my senior thesis recital, I did a one act musical as the second half of it. I brought in people from the theater department to be in it. And of course, as is the case in almost all schools I've experienced, the music department and the theater department are separate and don't talk to each other, and I don't
Yeah.
understand why. um, so that was like kind of the first time that both, or at least in a while, that both departments had been like, "Wow, yeah, we've got talented students on both sides of this divide, essentially." But I just continued to have that sort of pull towards writing musical theater. I never really had like a moment of falling in love that most of people that I hear a lot of people have, but it was sort of a slow gravitation of like, this is really cool in that like all of these people from all these different disciplines are working together. Like, I really have no idea what that lighting designer is doing, but it's making this thing better, even though it has nothing to do overtly with music or drama necessarily, but it's like a part of the bigger overall picture. That was really cool and appealing to me. And so I was like, well, if I'm going to do this musical theater thing one way or another, I should probably go and see what it's like to be in New York. And I interned there for a summer and I really liked it. And so I applied to NYU's grad writing program sort of as like an excuse to move to New York because I knew that I wouldn't have enough context to find work right away if I just went sort of cold. But I was like, all right, if I go there for 2 years and sort of expand my network, then I might be able to put down roots once I graduate. And that worked out better than I could have possibly imagined. The last week that I was in Miami, I went to a beach party, and someone that I knew but wasn't really friends with from the jazz school was there, and we got to talking, and he was saying how he did this gig with Alex Lacamoire, and I was like, "Excuse me." Then I had only known from his work on In the Heights, and I know he'd done a bunch of other things by then, but I was not as knowledgeable about the theater then. And I was like, "That's so cool." And he was like, "Yeah, I'll drop him a line and tell him you're coming to New York." And I was like, "Yeah, yeah, right, okay."
Yeah.
And then I got to New York, and Alex Lacamoire Facebook messaged me and was like, "Hey, congrats on moving to the city and on NYU, and let me know if you want any tips on the business or living here." And I was like, "This is unreal."
Yeah.
So we ended up talking on the phone. We had a bunch of mutual friends because he grew up in Miami, and I think it's his sort of unspoken principle that he likes to help young people sort of get their start in New
Mm.
York because something similar happened to him when he first moved here, and then he was playing subbing on Lion King when he was 23 because someone just sort of like gave him the opportunity. So I think he sort of likes to pass that on to other young fresh faced people. So he invited me to sort of just play through some things from Hamilton and then just like in general, and then introduced me to the associate conductor and had me come back and sit in the pit after opening. And the associate conductor and I clicked. And so we were talking after, and Alex was like, "So, what's your schedule like?" Like essentially offering me a job. And I was like,
Oh.
"Well, I'm kind of busy this semester with grad school, but next semester is better." And he was like, "Great, we'll need more pianists in the spring."
Oh.
Yeah, so I got very lucky just really falling into that gig without earning it in any sort of way, I feel. And I know that I deserve to be there. That's the thing that I always have to tell myself is like, well, if I got the job and I still have it, then I must be doing something right.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that was my sort of path to theater, and now I have the degree from NYU, and I'm writing with regularly with 1 to 3 people from that I've met there at any given time, plus people that I met while I was in college, and yeah, and so just playing theater all day and writing theater all the rest of the day.
I love that. How do you balance, all of your projects?
Yeah, I think an analogy that a lot of us use is polyamorous couples, where you sort of have to devote time to one person and the other people have to kind of be understanding of that. I find that this is especially true of composers because for whatever reason they appear to be busier than lyricists. And so lyricists often have to like kind of hound their composers to get them to work with them because they're working on so many projects at a given time. I've been lucky so far in that it really seems like there's only one show at a time that is super active. Like, I haven't had to like, 2 performances of anything in the same month, for example, where I would have to, like, prepare 2 drafts at the same time. I think I would not handle that well. But it's also a matter of planning and being like, "Well, I really like, if we're gonna self-impose a deadline, here are the other shows that are happening in my calendar, so let's find, like, an open month where one of those is not active, and then we can work together on that." And people have been really understanding, which is really nice, and a lot of those people also work with other people, but I think there are at least a couple of my co-writers that only work with me, and so I have been very grateful for their understanding and grace and generosity of spirit and being like, "Okay, well, I'll see you sometime."
Yeah.
But yeah, and all of them are also humans and understand the value of mental health and not overworking because the kind of work that you produce when you're completely burnt out is not really going to be coming from a joyous or authentic place in the
Mhm.
first place. And so it's better to just like make sure that you give yourself some breathing room and not pack your schedule too tightly. I think this is a thing that it feels like a very obvious thing, but it's something that I'm still sort of realizing over the last few years. Because in grad school, I was like, well, I'm just going to work for every spare second that I have, and all these late nights are fine, and I don't need a social life or exercise or a healthy diet. And now I'm like, oh no, I don't want that like tortured genius life. If that's what it takes, then I'd rather make good art than great art and
Yeah.
just like be a holistic human instead. And I think actually, and I feel like there's science to support this, that like that healthy overall lifestyle that's balanced and includes a lot of different facets is actually better for your creative stimulus anyway. So if I am in a particularly bad mental health place where I'm like, oh, I feel so guilty because I'm not working right now, if I have to tell myself that it's helping the work to rest, and if that's the only way I can get myself to rest, fine. We'll find better motivation down the line, but at least we're like getting to the right place, if that makes sense.
Mhm. What does rest look like for you?
Lately, I've been getting back into a reading habit, which is great. I used to read a lot when I was a kid and even in college, but started to get too busy for it. But it turns out if you can get a seat on the subway, it's a perfect time to read. I'm a video gamer, and the latest Animal Crossing just came out for the Nintendo Switch, so I've been obsessed with that. Um, watching TV shows. I just finished The Good Place with Ian, and now we're watching Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Yeah, not necessarily, again, like part of my brain is like, oh, that's not as productive as I want it to be. I want to be like going on runs all the time and learning another language and like doing that kind of thing with my free time. And then the other part of my brain is like, just let yourself exist.
Yeah. Yeah, balance is hard.
Yes, sure is.
And it seems like if once you find it, then a worldwide pandemic happens or, it's like
Yes,
once you kind of
yes,
like, "Okay, this is balanced and something in life changes," either you,
yes.
like, break up with someone or you
Hmm.
move or, it's like you're always balanced, like it's never stable.
Yeah, absolutely. Like last semester, I sort of very purposefully took less work because I knew it was going to be a big writing time. We had an industry workshop for Medusa in October, and then we had a deadline for the Midsummer musical also in the fall. And I was like, I'm just gonna not take on any extra work, and I'm just gonna write. And that was great. And then in December, I looked at my bank account, and it was not great. So lately, I've sort of been envisioning there are three things at any given time, and you get to pick two, and they are work for money, creative writing work, and then like free time mental health restoration. And I'm
Mm.
trying to figure out how to have all three, but I'm sort of resigning myself to the like, all right, at any given time, you can sort of focus on two. Yeah, and then this quarantine happens, and I'm like, well, now I have all the free time. um, but it doesn't necessarily, of course, mean that my brain is switching to, oh, let's like write with everyone all the time now. Like I want that to be where my brain is, but it's also like I just played 7 recitals. I needed this break anyway, and it coincided with my spring break last week, so I sort of like let myself off the hook and be a little lazy just to sort of like find that balance again, even though a lot of people are sort of being driven mad with all of the time that they now have. As someone who's sort of an introvert and a homebody who hasn't been able to indulge either of those traits lately, I am finding it very restorative.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think just forcing people to, I mean, if they can manage to get off of the internet and reading about it enough for long enough, I think this is a great moment to have like sort of a reset button and just like have people be forced to be alone with their thoughts again and appreciate how meaningful and wonderful a walk is. You know,
Mhm.
these very simple and human interactions, and how those are the things that are going to get us through this time when we don't have work, which is what a lot of us place our identity in. I think it's
Mhm.
going to be, if people, yeah, if it turns out to be the opportunity that I think and hope it is, I think it'll be a great chance for people to sort of refresh and reevaluate what their priorities are.
For sure. What are some of the good things that you see happening in the theater world right now?
Ooh, I feel like a lot of the pieces that are being written now are questions of identity and intersectionality and these kinds of things that traditionally don't make their way to the Broadway stage. And I wouldn't say that necessarily those things are going to make it there, but the fact that they exist and are compelling is really exciting to me. I love that there are more pieces being put out by women composers and writers. I'm always partial to that. I like the proliferation of styles that's happening even on Broadway. Like
Mhm.
the fact that we have a rap musical, quote unquote, even though that was 4 years ago, it's still exciting that it exists. And like Hadestown, I like all of these shows that are kind of off the beaten path, but like being artistically and financially, it seems rewarded for it. That's exciting to
Mhm.
me, just to see
Mhm.
something fresh and new, and it feels like there's a hunger for that. So I'm excited about that.
There's always going to be bad things happening, and there's always going to be, theaters closing and
Hmm.
um whatnot. But I like to try to ask people like, okay, what good are you seeing? What
Yeah.
trends are you seeing develop that you think will have a positive impact?
Yeah, I just saw you now. What you just said reminded me. I saw Heroes of the Fourth Turning at Playwrights Horizons, which was a play, and it was basically just these five young, smart, conservative people sort of discussing a lot of the things that I think, or discussing things in a way that I think a lot of liberal folks would normally dismiss as being impossible. I think there's a lot of like dismissal of people who don't believe what you believe and not
Mhm.
sort of conceptualizing them as also like humans with well reasoned ideas and beating hearts. And so that I was really excited to see that because I am very much of a mind of just like remembering that everyone that you come across has a reason for thinking the way that they do, and just like radical compassion and those kinds of things are things that I'm really interested in. And to see that on stage was really exciting in a such a very like sort of left leaning city as New York, and to see it received so well because it was really well done and exciting and chilling. And it's like I don't know how I would argue with a lot of the points that these people are bringing up. And that was really nice to see. Just things that sort of like make me challenge my own notions about like the world and my place in it. I love that kind of stuff and seeing it affect other people too. It's very exciting.
Mhm. Yeah, it's such a great time to be in the arts right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. If you've had failure in your life, which I don't want to assume that you have, but
It's a
probably
fair
most people,
assumption. Yeah.
yeah, most people have, if not everyone has had failure in their life. How do you
Yeah.
handle like failure and or disappointment or a project that went south? How do you handle those negative things that happen in your
Such
in
an
your life?
excellent question. There's so many ways to fail, I feel like. You made me think of like four different things at once.
Yeah.
So like in college when I didn't end up auditioning for that double major because they didn't really see the potential in me, I responded by just like working my butt off on practicing more than I'd ever practiced before, and sort of being inspired by my other friends who were practicing a lot, and just really putting my nose to the grindstone. And I think that was absolutely correct for that moment in time. And I think now my response to failure is a little different. It's not necessarily to just be like, well, I'll show you and I'll work as hard as I can, because like sometimes overwork is not great and is not the answer. I auditioned for a show to be the rehearsal pianist and subconductor for a show in the fall, and I I didn't really prepare the material enough, but I also misunderstood the way they asked me to prepare the material too. So I went into the audition, realized that the very thing that I had been studiously avoiding practicing was the thing that they wanted to hear.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And I was like, do I say something? Do I like show them the email receipts, or do I just kind of fumble this and hope that in 20 years we'll have a drink and I'll mention this and the misunderstanding will be cleared up? And that, like, I didn't get that show. And it turned out to be good because it was, again, like, that was the time that was a busy writing time for me. And then my grandfather also passed away unexpectedly. And so, like, had to fly back for the funeral. And there was just like a lot of stuff that came up that I would not have been able to deal with well at all if I had taken that on, because that would have taken so much of my focus, because I would have worked myself to death even once I got it, to like feel like I earned the spot in the room. And so sometimes I feel like the response to failure is just to be like, okay, yep, that is okay. And I think I'm very lucky in that I've had a lot of success and a lot of positive feedback, and I can reasonably trust in my skills and the network that I've built and the way that I am living now to continue to just bring me success in a way. And so in that way, the failures don't hit as hard because they don't mean everything. Like, that is just one thing that I did not get. But there are so many other things in my life that are great. And like, I am so glad that I'm investing in friendships, and that feels like sort of a buffer against failure too. Just like making sure that you have a support system so that when things do go wrong, it's not that like everything went wrong. Yeah. And lately, some of the hardest failures to bounce back from are show related ones from things that I've written, where either you spend all of your time for, months throwing your passion into this project, and then you happen to get like a music director who could not care less about doing your music justice, who like
Mm.
is just there for the paycheck and is pretty flagrant about it. And so the musical all but falls apart because of the music team. Or you have a great show and everyone walks out saying how excited they are about it, and then people who said that they were going to give you opportunities stop answering your emails. Stuff like that. And so it's been hard to sort of find a place between hope and excitement and cynicism, to just be like, all right, well, I know that most opportunities don't pan out no matter how insistent people are about them, and that is okay. And so I'm not going to put my stock in this future opportunity until I have a contract in hand, or even
Mhm.
until it's over. So sometimes, especially if you've got several of those in a row, I can find that to be really discouraging. But it feels like there's always something going right, because then like two shows will tank at once, and then a student will tag me in a video of them singing a song that I wrote, and they're doing just a great job, and that's really exciting to me. So it's like, all right, there's always something. And then if everything is going to crash down all at once and I need to like take a break from writing or something, that's also okay, because that's not necessarily who I am. And again, that comes back to the like, if I have friends and if I have other interests, then I can still have a fulfilling life, even if like
Mhm.
this aspect of it isn't really going well or needs to be halted for a while. That's hard to say, I think, and hard for any artist to think when it really does become such a big part of who we are. But I think it's helpful to remember that it's not all of who we are in that way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think that's also one of the benefits of getting older is that you have more perspective. You can look back and be like, "Oh, I've had a lot of failures in my life and but I'm still making it. I'm
Yeah.
still in this career and I'm still hanging and I'm still,
Hmm.
getting paid to work and whatnot." And I think sometimes getting older can be a really helpful thing as well.
Yes, definitely. I think you're very right about that. Just sort of collecting experiences and being like, oh, yeah. And then the other thing is to remember that you've had successes and triumphs, and everyone has them. And it's very easy to be like, oh, but none of that matters right now. What matters is this next thing that's looming over me. And it's like, no, like, is that what you're doing this for? Is that why you're in this? So you can just worry about the next thing all the time? Or can you like actually sit back and enjoy and reminisce over all of the wonderful things that have happened as a result of you pursuing this path? You know,
Mhm.
yeah, I'm right
Mhm.
there with you.
A question I asked myself, I've been asking myself a lot lately, just like looking back about career and thinking about life is it worth it?
Hmm.
because I love it. So it can be really hard. So
Yeah.
for you, how would you answer that? Asking yourself, has it been worth it and is it worth it?
Yeah. I feel like it's definitely been worth it. I'm so grateful for the life that I get to lead and all of the amazing experiences I've had and the people I've met, and that all has been incredible. I know that I am of a privileged few who are able to say that they've worked on Broadway and that they've had good experiences. Like, all of the companies I've been a part of at the top have been nothing but kind to me, and that's been awesome. So just getting to sort of see that, and then essentially that my idols are worth, looking up to, even if you met them at a personal level. That's been awesome. And I think it's worth it as long as you're still deriving joy from it. And I think we get locked into this, like, well, now I'm an artist for life and I can't change forever. And, but like, I can't remember the statistic. The average American changes careers like 6 times over the course of their life, not just jobs. And
Mhm.
that, once I learned that, which is very different from like our parents' generation, it's just, I don't think there's going to be as much judgment involved from other people if you decide to switch tracks. Because I know people who were incredibly talented artists and then they decided to do something else. And it's like, if you want to pursue something that feels more secure or it feels like a better source of happiness, whatever it is, and then still keep art in your life in some way, I think that's a completely legitimate course of action. It's so hard, right? I think I also see a lot of actors who, I think actors have it the hardest out of all of us, at least of the
Yeah.
people that I see, where
Mhm.
they like, we don't really have to audition that much. They have to audition all the time, and
Yeah.
they're getting judged almost as a person instead of just on their skills. And it's like,
Yeah.
it's a whole other level of like, if you have to have the most militant mental health strategy to weather that. And I could totally see why people would get burned out and just be like, especially in New York, it's such a different game to play than like working in community theater or doing, less pressury, more joyous productions and environments. And I think it's good to ask yourself, is it worth it? And not in a despairing way, but in a just like, I deserve to be happy. And if I'm not happy here, then I can allow myself to consider something else. I still feel bad saying that because I want to be like, it's absolutely worth it no matter what. Like, the art is the best thing and it transcends, poverty and not being able to pay your bills. And I think, yeah, it goes back to that balance thing where it's like, or I know people who work at Google and then they like write poetry and find other ways to participate in art and live certainly fulfilling lives. And that is a totally valid choice too. I wish I had a definitive answer for you.
Yeah. Well, I think the best questions don't.
Yeah.
So my last question, I already have asked you advice question, but advice for young, let's say young musicians
Hmm.
who are in school, who love playing for theater, what advice would you give them?
I'd say that you don't necessarily have to go to a big school to succeed in it. I know people who would fight me on that. um, but I think I've seen people who have not gone to those like big schools that are direct feeders to Broadway, and that's totally a path. Like, if you're really serious about it, and if you're like, Broadway is the only answer for me, then I think it's wise to pursue one of those big schools that's going to like set you there. Like, NYU has this program now with Ted Sperling, John Miller teaches there. Like, they've sort of got the resources there to sort of propel you right into those kinds of paths. And there are a few other schools, but so you can do that, or you can like go to a school that's not going to drain you of all your money and still have a good legitimate experience. And here's what I would say is that your experience is going to be primarily shaped by you, no matter where you end up going. I find that a lot of school systems are very similar in that you kind of have to game the system to get what you want out of them. And sometimes that means taking classes that have nothing to do with your major, or like popping over to the theater department and being like, hey, I'm a resource if you would like me. Some of the most valuable stuff that I learned were just like by playing for classes in the theater department. And as it pertains to our industry now, and sometimes it was just in like casual conversations with my other professors, and like that's those are the real kernels that you'll get. It won't be because you have this pedigree necessarily. And I know that I speak from a privileged place because I did go to NYU and I did go to the University of Miami, but I still like the experiences that I most treasure are those little kernels that happened outside of classroom settings a lot of the time.
Mhm.
So yeah, just like take don't be afraid to take charge of what you want. If you want to learn about something that's not in your course load, go learn it and talk to the people that can make it happen. Because as frustrating as the bureaucracy of college can be, there are also a lot of faculty there who are passionate about helping students primarily.
Great advice. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this, Rachel.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
The music for the Backstage Creative was improvised and performed by Ian Leroy, and the logo was designed by Zach Rimbold.